Russia's own actions, or the government's own actions, overextending itself, overreaching, it's actually weakened itself relative to before, and if anything, made NATO more appealing than it was before. Or you just don't agree with that? I just don't see how it's benefited Russia.
I totally agree on the point that Ukrainian crisis, Ukrainian war, it's the number one priority for Russia's foreign and domestic policy, because we see here the intertwined between foreign and domestic policy. And indeed, so it's the matter of the importance for and strategic importance and the importance for strengthening sovereignty and all the things. And also we need to look at this conflict in Ukraine, this war in Ukraine, is a starting point for this new architecture of the world order. So it's not just only some wishful thinking, maybe it's not just only some idealistic perceptions, it's not about even, just creating a new narrative with no substance inside. So it's, I think, the opposite.
This is The Global Gambit.
Okay, but you keep coming back to interest, but Olga, I'm trying to acknowledge, pragmatically speaking, right, solutions here, in the sense of if Russia, some Western observers would be uncomfortable with the fact I'm even talking about holding a referendum to discuss whether Crimea was kept as part of Ukraine, right? But I'm trying to be genuinely pragmatic in the sense of, in a hypothetical scenario where the war hadn't been in its current state of play, right? Russia's like, okay, we'll approach this through the Security Council at the UN. We're going to raise a resolution, a vote that we would like the Security Council to pass, that we would like to hold a referendum at the future of Crimea, right? And obviously we have to assume, there's a lot of assumptions here that Ukraine is okay with that there isn't a veto by the Americans, whatever, right? The point is that I'm even trying to acknowledge that, offer some solutions here, but because some Westerners are like, no, that's not the case anymore, forget about it. And that's where I'm going to go now, which is sort of your point about Ukraine being an artificial creature, which I have some issue with, if I'm honest. But sort of in that case, how far back do we go? Do we say that Britain is part of the Roman Empire because it was once conquered by the Romans? What about Israel as an artificial state? It's not even 80 years old yet. How do you justify saying that about Ukraine when it very clearly is now a nation state? It has existed. The economy is growing quite well relative to Russia's in previous years. So I would like to talk with you about the Russian economy maybe in the future, because this has been more historical, ideological, whatever, a debate. But isn't it time to change this mindset that Ukraine is this artificial thing and it doesn't fully exist? Because clearly it does now, and it's not going anywhere, much like the Palestinians' frustration over Israel, but Israel's not going anywhere now. I feel that this mindset of a lot of Russians or some people in Russia or whatever is I don't know, explain it to me further, because I'm struggling to understand.
Well, it's a good question. So how long or how far in the history we should go? Just maybe to identify our historical rights, or maybe our perceptions, how the things should be done, or how they should be constructed in reality in the contemporary world. So I'm not really sure about the Great Britain, but what I see from my point of view, so this colonial narrative, so definitely it is something what Great Britain pursues, and I do not see any signs to somehow just to drop this narrative. Okay, but look at let's have a look at China. So the issue of with Hong Kong and Macau, well, using the historical right and the change in geopolitics and change of economic and technological or any type of Chinese development, we see so these territories have been taken back to the heartland, to the mainland of China. Okay, so the next issue is Taiwan. So how Taiwan is perceived by China? Well, it's a part of one China policy. The things will be done maybe not today, but probably tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. So, and how Russia would look. So, what exactly some historical dates are important for us? Well, depends on something what we want to obtain, something what we need to achieve. And for now, the Ukraine is the number one issue. This conflict, this war in Ukraine is number one of our not even foreign policy, but domestic policy concern, because we see this territory, which is like 20% of former Ukraine territories, it's part of Russia. And Russia invests a lot, and Russia not just only helps these people, but actually included this territory as a part of its own territory for the development and everything. So, but no, nonetheless, so this front line in Ukraine, which is now, well, it slowly moves towards the west of Ukraine, or at least towards the geographical middle of Ukraine. Well, for how long, what kind of justification we would have, well, it's hard to say. Because based on our 1,000 years of our own history, and considering our foreign policy attitude from this very long period of time, we see so our geography predetermined our foreign policy behavior with our move to the Russia's far east, to the Siberia, to the far east, and as well as our move to the northwest of Russia, where is St. Petersburg now, and also our move towards southwest and to the Caucasus, to the south direction. So if we consider from this bigger perspective, even 1,000 of years perspective, this territory is the starting point for our determination of our understanding. Maybe that would be a question how far in history we can go just to justify, to understand, and actually to behave in a certain way. I'm not really sure if the Roman Empire can be, so this narrative can be used in British colonial or foreign policy narrative, but the colonial narrative definitely it's in the mind of British people, it seems to me. Anyway, so well, every country has its history. Some countries have a long history. Some of them, as Israel, has a very short history, but nonetheless. So it's up to a country or a nation to decide. So what would be relevant for us just to explain, to determine our foreign policy behavior.
Yes, I appreciate that, but you don't operate in a vacuum. Russia's foreign policy does not operate in a vacuum. And while I acknowledge there's a lot we've covered here, so I will have not responded to some points that you've said, but one thing you did say about, NATO's containment. Yes, you could definitely argue that there is a desire by the United States specifically or especially to undermine Russia as a rival power. Right? Many people wouldn't consider it a great power anymore. Some people will. But the point is that America wanted to remove any Russian influence in Europe. That's what some people who are anti-Ukraine or more pro-Russia or whatever would say, that this is within America's interests to be. What was the statement about NATO? It's to keep the Germans down, the Russians out, and the Americans in, or whatever the expression was. From when NATO was first created. So I can certainly appreciate that's how some Russians might view it. But that being said, the Great Britain Roman point was more of a tongue-in-cheek emphasis that how far back do you go to recognize that a country doesn't actually exist because it was once dominated by another group of people? Crimea, you were saying, was dominated by the Ottoman Empire. So technically, does Crimea actually belong to Turkey then? And also, you mentioned Hong Kong and China, one of the countries that I focus on a lot. Hong Kong was transferred peacefully from Britain to China. Why couldn't that be done in the case of Russia and Crimea? Your point has actually, if anything, proven mine, which is that you can find peaceful means to do so. And the growing tension over Taiwan between America and China, or the Southeast Asian 9-dash line and all that is growing. But a lot of countries around China feel that they are belligerent, they are revisionist, that they want to, forcibly reacquire certain territories, including, mind you, Olga, a piece of Russia, Manchuria. So can we really say that the best way to engage with this is force, not, peaceful means? And I know you may reiterate that Russia tried that and it didn't work, but did Russia really try? I said a lot there, so you're welcome to rebuttal me, but I want you to do a better job of persuading me, because right now I'm not convinced.
All right. So Crimea was returned back to Russia on a very peaceful manner. So here is no single shot was done. So here is this conventional warfare was initiated. So in this case, it was done by peaceful ways. Maybe some diplomatic approach, which you've been mentioned. So it didn't happen as what probably was expected by Westerners. Anyway, it's already done, but in a very peaceful manner. Maybe I don't get your question. So, Crimea, it's a very peculiar issue for Russian domestic policy. And yes, so we just made the things right. Definitely it would be
I
also
can clarify
the way
my
of...
question if it helps. Let me clarify my question. Very simply, you mentioned that Hong Kong is, a territory that was part of China, and then during the Opium Wars, and Britain took it. The same as Macau with Portugal or whoever, right? But my rebuttal to that, my response is that Hong Kong was transferred back to China peacefully, and equally, it's not a country either. It's a territory. So this whole point about, that you mentioned about Crimea not being a country and therefore the UN maybe isn't as relevant. What's your response? Because undermines what you're saying.
Okay, so Crimea was returned, I'm repeating myself, it was returned in a peaceful manner, but we need to see, or maybe we need to acknowledge, so if it wouldn't be done, so what would happen next with the enlargement of NATO, considering this is the Black Sea? Because Russia has access to the Black Sea, to the Baltic Sea, to the northern route through the Arctic and the Pacific Oceans, North Pacific. So basically, all these things, they consist of integrity and our position of security. So this is a part of our sovereignty and security and everything. And if we look at Crimea, so Crimea has a very peculiar, very important strategic view. Because along the Black Sea, we see the NATO countries. So we see Turkey is a NATO country on the south. We see Bulgaria also as a part of NATO. So we see potential Georgia being in part of NATO, but it didn't happen. So if Ukraine was a part of NATO, and if Crimea would be part of Ukraine, we see Russia would lose its access to the Black Sea, which is a part of our strategic importance. So it's unbelievable that Russia would give up, the security point when it comes to the Black Sea. And I think this is a rational explanation, not to mention the 300 years of our fight with the Ottoman Empire and with the Russian-speaking people, with Russian identity, with the Sevastopol. It's a port for Navy, the Black Sea fleet. So basically, it's part of our security. And how we would give up, and just for what? For the sake of Western narrative would somehow agree on Russia's action? No, we wouldn't expect this. So it's security. It's our security. And I think we should not blame any country which concerned about its security. So imagine if, let's say, Russian rockets, Russian military, like a military base was somewhere on the border of the United States. We had this example during the Cuban crisis some time ago. And so we see it was indeed a crisis, a nuclear crisis. And probably we cannot imagine that Russia's military base has been somewhere on the border line of Mexico, for instance. So because the United States would react. Why do you think Russia would not react on this military American basis on NATO? Okay, so NATO basis, somewhere close for these strategic important territories. So we would expect that Russia would react, maybe even aggressively. Well, because it's part of our security.
Yeah, I actually do appreciate all of that. Well, much of that, in the sense of Russia cannot, and this is where I do have a problem with enlargement, the same as the EU, for different reasons, not necessarily related to Russia, Ukraine, but I can understand very much how Russia would feel if you have Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia as part of NATO, because then you really do have an effective cutoff. But that being said, Olga, Turkey is already part of NATO. They completely control the Bosphorus, and the Montreux Treaty is what I'm trying to think of, right? In 1938 or whatever it was signed. Right? So you already have a very important player, the second biggest military, mind you, actually in NATO, controlling one of Russia's primary naval access routes. What difference would adding Georgia or other countries make to the strategic importance, to quote you?
I think it's a big difference when we talk about European countries of being NATO members and Turkey being a NATO member. We understand from some security reasons it can be considered as a success for NATO to obtain Turkey for some time ago. It's for quite a long time ago. It was the same period of time when Turkey wanted to just express its interest to be part of European Union as well. Also, it didn't happen. We know. And now Turkey changed its attitude. And now, so definitely, it seems to me that Turkey redirected its strategic interests from Western-led world in NATO or European Union to the world majority and to the regional hegemony, or maybe like a regional leading position. So Turkey, I think it's something different. And I think we should consider Turkey's position, the strategic position. It is unnecessarily could be correspondent with European interests, with American interests. Well, technically, yes, they're part of NATO. So yes, they sign a document, so they should behave in a certain way because there's a legally binding agreement and everything. But at the same time, Turkey is different comparison to France, let's say, or maybe or Germany is being a NATO countries. So the situation with like a potential Azerbaijan or Armenia. So it's a sphere of Russia's historical sphere of Russia's influence. So it's our borders. So it's our security. So and of course Russia would oppose at any cost, I believe, if the enlargement of NATO and some military bases, NATO, American or just European military bases somehow would appear in Russian borders. But you can say, okay, so but what about Finland? So what about the Baltic states? Well, Finland and Baltic states, we consider them as a part of Western European culture, and so this identity is different. But when it comes to Caucasus region, when it comes to Turkey, it's a bit different. So it's not exactly the different people, but countries which have a bit different perceptions, and we acknowledge this. So basically, I think we cannot make a comparison and put on the same line, let's say, for strategic purposes, like a Turkey is a NATO country, and let's say it's Germany is a NATO country. It could be something different. So, and in this
Olga,
case,
go on. I'll let you finish your point, but I do want to pick up on one thing you've said.
no, the South Caucasus countries. So it's different in a way how Russia possesses these countries. It's how Russia looks at these countries and how Russia perceives its own security. If it will be undermined in a way, if this South Caucasus region will be somehow militarily covered by the NATO countries, it's different comparison to the Baltic states.
Okay, I'll leave Baltics and Finland for now because I want to focus on the Caucasus then. Okay, so 2 points that I'd like your response to, which is very simply that you said it nearly at the beginning of your previous response, which was that, well, Turkey's part of NATO, but it's slightly different. Wait, so it's not because it's not Europe. So it actually isn't about NATO then. It's actually about Europe and West. Because NATO, there doesn't seem to be as much problem with Turkey because they adopt a slightly more global view, or what you said, the majority view, or non-Western view, right? But they are part of NATO, so surely that should be a problem. But now you're saying that it isn't a problem. So I feel like you're contradicting yourself a bit there. Second point, yes, I can understand Russia not wanting the Caucasus as part of NATO, but Russia already had Armenia, Azerbaijan as part of the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, right? Which is Russia's modern variation of the Warsaw Pact in response to NATO, right? But because Putin has put all his focus on Ukraine and neglected both Armenia and Azerbaijan, but especially Armenia, what have they done? They've signed a peace treaty, well, whatever, a sort of a deal with Trump, of all people, and now Turkey's moving in. So if anything, Putin's focus so much on Ukraine has undermined his interests and Russia's influence in the Caucasus. Is that not a bad decision?
No, I do not think so, and I do not believe I somehow contradict myself. So when we talk about this, let's say legal frameworks, or is the frameworks of certain organizations, on regional organizations, I think something would not work, or something maybe did not work as it was expected, as you mentioned about this collective treaty organization with Russia and some post-Soviet states. But I think if something could not work, so it does not mean we need to revive it and just to push forward. It's about the way to focus on some different configurations, I would say. And now what I can say, so it's the development of BRICS, it's development of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in which these countries, they consider to be, they have definitely their own interest just to be somehow be part of this world majority architectural configuration of the new world order. So, and basically, okay, so, well, something would not work, something can be considered, maybe it's a strategic failure if we talk about this South Caucasus, so this framework, but okay, so, but we focus on to something different, in building some different frameworks with a long-term perspectives. It definitely can bring its positive results. So in this case, I think the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS, they are accelerated, especially after 2022, they are accelerated and they provide those platforms for different type of coordination and cooperation between countries, including Turkey and including the countries of the South Caucasus.
Okay, fine. I agree. The BRICS have become more of a alternative, an option than I used to think of them. It was frankly a bit of a joke, but but they lack substance. NATO is they're completely different. One's a security alliance, another one is a economic bloc. Right, so they're very different in nature. The SCO it's interesting, but I have, look, I don't want to get too sidetracked about those. We could talk about those, maybe the question afterwards. But just to finish on the Caucasus, I don't really feel like you answered my question, though, because do you not understand my point, which is or do you not recognize what I'm saying, which is because Putin has put so much emphasis on Ukraine, he's neglected other areas where Russia was the security provider. Russia had basically control over the Caucasus, and NATO was never going to remotely be present there, right? Russia would have blocked it or attempt to or something, right? But because of Russia's own actions, or the government's own actions, overextending itself, overreaching, it's actually weakened itself relative to before, and if anything, made NATO more appealing than it was before. Or you just don't agree with that? I just don't see how it's benefited Russia.
I totally agree on the point that Ukrainian crisis, Ukrainian war, it's a number one priority for Russia's foreign and domestic policy, because we see here the intertwined between foreign and domestic policy. And indeed, so it's the matter of the importance and strategic importance and the importance for strengthening sovereignty and all the things. And also we need to look at this conflict in Ukraine, this war in Ukraine is a starting point for this new architecture of the world order. So it's not just only some wishful thinking, maybe it's not just only some idealistic perceptions. It's not about even, just creating a new narrative with no substance inside. So it's, I think, the opposite. And I think that Russia exactly pursues this approach with a long-term approach, with the things which we can which we can do right away, and the first priority, it's Ukraine. And then we see the things will play out and how they would impact of the new world architecture in which Russia is one of co-architects. Definitely. Well, Caucasus, it seems to be somehow just put aside or put on the margins of Russian foreign policy right now, but it doesn't mean it's forgotten or somehow, because it will be, or it is already considered as a part of the future architecture of the new world order, not led by the Western countries. And if we look at this deeper and wider perspective and the long-term perspective, maybe it can be taken as an explanation why Russia is active in Ukraine, why Russia is not active in let's say in Armenia or in Azerbaijan. All right, so but we create something different at the same time, just focusing on the resolving this issue in Ukraine, because it's a primary importance.
Hey, I'll take what you say there, but I guess, as we begin to wrap up our debate, I want to understand a couple more things from you. Firstly, in relation to the SEO and this New World Order thing. Okay, yes, I think we can all agree, or many acknowledgement would be made, that particularly under Trump, the United States is imploding or significantly undermining the international Western-led or US-led order, its own hegemonic status, and China especially is taking up the mantle to replace it or counterbalance. But do you think that that's the wisest thing for Russia, right? We can argue whether the West has pushed Russia away or Russia did it of its own choice or whatever. We've touched on that a lot. But very simply, Olga, China is the dominant partner in this relationship. And do you think it's wise, or do you think it's a good idea for Russia to align so much now with China, or this non-Western entity, that some people think that Russia is basically becoming a client state, a vassal state of China? You're welcome to disagree with that, but are you not worried about this direction?
Well, still it's a part, I recognize a part of Western narrative, which represents China as a patron and Russia as a client state in one way or another. So I would not agree, and I would argue so against the statement that China is a dominant partner for Russia. So we have a strategic partnership, and of course, from economic perspective, well, Chinese position is somehow different. So indeed, and the economic weight and economic capacity is way more. But when we talk about international stance, we need to think about the strategic capacity, this military capacity. It is something what consists of a state's power, and Russia is a very powerful state. And what is important also, when some Western commentators they often say that Russia's the mineral resources, gas, oil, and everything is Russia's curse, but I would say it's blessing. So in this case, considering Russia's self-efficiency and self-sufficiency, self-reliance, and this military capacity, it is something, and territory as well. It is something what makes Russia indeed a great power. So Chinese economic capacity, yes, indeed, it's way more than Russian economic capacity, but at the same time, with using different, weights of somehow measuring a great power, Russia and China, we see they're compatible to each other, but we probably should not weight them in terms of this great power competition, because we're talking about strategic partnership. And what's important, we have a shared vision for the new world architecture. So it's against Western dominance, it's against some Western narrative in a way of liberal values and everything. And I think it is something what should be counted. This is the main issue. And also, I would not agree that Russia somehow is at a risk, has put itself at a risk in strategic cooperation with China. Not at all. Why? Maybe the United States feels itself at a risk having these economic ties, very strong economic ties with China, and Trump's attempt just to have these trade wars and tariff wars, maybe because the United States became somehow too dependent on China. So, well, definitely we cannot talk about this dependency of Russia on China in economic terms. So definitely China is not a hegemonic power, and we have these strategic relations, and we have this weight of two countries that somehow compatible to each other. But once again, so the most important part is a shared vision of the new world architecture, and this the fundamental things of this new architecture. It's something what we actually do together with China. We mentioned about BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and everything. So it's not against the West, but it's without the West.
Yeah, look, I will again try to sort of bridge by saying that I think that the West needs to get a hold of its foreign policy in the sense of, and I don't really like the term West anymore, never have done, because that basically involves what, 40, 50 countries, Europe, Japan, Korea, America, Australia, etc., right? There's a lot of different opinions in the West, right? Italy or Spain have been less willing to raise their NATO spending versus, say, the British or the Estonia, the Baltic states, right? So I think that we need to be more, well, distance ourselves from that collective term. However, and this is the last thing I want to ask you, which is, and you're welcome to, share any closing remarks as well, which is simply that, okay, yeah, China is the alternative, and it's growing, and it's the strategic partnership, but it's not an equal one, Olga. China does not see Russia as anything but largely a means to an end. And you can say I'm incredibly anti-China by saying that or something, but I remain extremely skeptical that the CCP, President Xi Jinping, really, really loves Russia because of some, romantic reason. He doesn't. He is a pragmatist. He wants national rejuvenation of China. He wants to compensate for the century of national humiliation, retake Manchuria is what I'm saying. He has his own territorial ambitions, which include parts of Russia. Or the Far East. So how can you not see this as a means to an end, and that the relationship between Russia and China is not as rosy as the Kremlin likes to say it is?
First of all, we do not know for sure what Xi Jinping is thinking about. That will be just our perceptions. We think, well, this way, but probably the reality is totally different. Because when the war in Ukraine has been started, so we see Chinese position was somehow neutral. Well, certain help to Russia, but at the same time, it's without some, diplomatic, very direct attitude or anything. It means just only one thing. We do not know for sure what Chinese leadership and Xi Jinping himself, what they're thinking about. Because you saying as a matter of fact, and I cannot agree with this, is that China has some ideas, maybe just to take some Russia's Far East, just back to what? It's never been part of China. So if we're talking about Manchuria, well, so those territories somehow differently can be considered as a part of historical China, or maybe not. So just, well, it's different, but nonetheless. So I would maybe encourage Western commentators not to be so certain and sure when you're now just labeling China or Russia into using certain terms or using certain narratives, because it just only is perceptions, but it does not mean they're true. And maybe just to know real intentions and real perceptions, maybe it's a good way just to initiate a dialogue. And it's great. We have this dialogue with you, so we have this conversation. Well, at least it's not about accepting the ideas, but at least trying just to see the different perspectives. So we can understand many things, but it doesn't mean we would accept this. So just some concluding remarks from diplomatic point of view, this negotiations or conversations or just communication channels or anything. Well, it's great, and I believe it is something what we have, and with the United States as with European countries as well. But it is not something what is publicly discussed, because it's a back channel communication. And I believe just keeping this communication going between Russia and the European countries, because we are neighbors and it will not be changed. And maybe without, or just maybe changing the attitude, instead of containing Russia, but maybe negotiating with Russia, maybe just talking to Russia. Maybe it's something what we should promote, maybe at least in our academic debates. So that would be something what I keep in my mind. But still, well, we wouldn't, and we should not consider Russia from a Western perspective. You should not consider Russia as being a small partner or just a client partner or anything which somehow would diminish Russia's influence. So because Russia is a great country in many respects, and it will remain this way.
Well, thank you, Olga. I would just say, we could continue this indefinitely, but we'll have to pick it up, I guess, another time. Maybe we can talk more specifically the economy and the domestic, and particularly the demographics of Russia, as demography is a lot of my personal, more academic background as well. But I would just point out that, if we look at history, 1971 clashes between the Soviet Union and China did happen over the border, and also 1860 when Russia took the territory from China. They haven't forgotten that. So, but that's, again, something we can pick up. And everyone watching, thank you very much for sticking with us. I know this has probably been a challenge for some of you, or some of you watching thinking this has been a roller coaster, but that's the point of what I'm bringing onto the channel by talking to Olga Krasnyak, Professor HSE University. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you all in the next one, everyone. Speak soon. Take care.